welcome to Mirage, where we're going to be speculating on ghost stories today. That's interesting. Actually, it's a great topic to explore, the construction of a ghost story. So if you think about it, it's an art form. A good horror film or ghost story is kind of literary.
Yes, very much so. Um,
Did you do any research?
I mean, my research is that I have read and written, hundreds of ghost stories, probably read more, written a few,
What is your favorite ghost
and sort
story?
of analyzed, a million more in terms of
What's your
research
favorite
for books.
of all time?
My favorite ghost story of
Is that a
all time.
is
That's
that a
a
ridiculous question?
It's a really hard question. Wait, let
Yeah.
me see what so I have I have ghost stories, modern ghost stories, like stories that people have told me
Well, yeah,
that
that's the
are
best kind, isn't it? I'm not even talking
yeah,
like reading
those are
James
my
Joyce or
favorite
something.
ghost
I'm
stories.
talking about what is your most like it freaked you out so bad ghost story.
Yeah. Oh, well, I
Tell it.
can tell you. Yeah,
Give
and
it away for
actually
free, actually.
yeah, give it away for free. Well, the thing is the most recent book that I wrote, which is coming out June 1st, but actually the publisher has started sending out copies for review, which is I want to get one to you so you can check it out.
Cool.
And it's this book in particular is a collection of in my earlier books I have always included like other people's experiences and a few ghost stories, especially in the first two, like the Book of the Bizarre and Beyond Bizarre. I have ghost stories in there, but this book is called Paranormal Parlor, so it's meant to be a collection of classic ghost tales, the hidden history behind some of the most maybe least known for being ghost writers. I don't mean ghost writers, but like horror writers.
Mhm.
There were a number of sort of upstanding citizens that dabbled in writing ghost stories. And then also there's a ton of experiences that I've had. And also, as you asked, just getting to your question, um, the stuff that scared the hell out of me when someone told me the
Somebody else
story.
told you.
Yeah. And I can tell you hands down, and I've been told a few, I do not scare easily. You might be surprised to learn that.
Where
But
did you say you lived in San Francisco? The meat pet? No, not the meat district. What do they call it? The tenderloin.
I did live in the
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah, the meat packing. It's good. I did live in the Tenderloin, so I don't scare easily,
Yeah,
right? I had
exactly.
lived in an alley, overlooking an alley in the
That makes it
Tenderloin
even worse.
on my
I
own
had to
for a
walk
number
by
of
a
years.
vampire every day on my way.
Exactly. Or a, prostitute is probably more
Okay,
like it, but,
whichever, doesn't matter. They both
drug
suck, right?
addict, Yeah. Yes, yes, they do. So in any case, I have been told stories over the years, and most of them I find incredibly fascinating and very interesting, and I love hearing people's sort of evidence or feelings about the paranormal and ghosts. But I have one friend in particular, and I included his story in this book because he told me this story years ago, and it terrified me in
Huh.
a way that I had never been terrified before. So we call it the and it's
Should I
all
bear down? I feel like I feel like I'm being told that
like
there is no
just
anesthesia and the operation will be going on as scheduled.
well, this actually kind of relates to the idea of like what makes a good ghost story. And so much of what makes a good ghost story or what makes a ghost story like this scary is the setting in which you're told it, right? So, not just the setting of the story, but the setting and the context in which you are being told the story and the person who is telling you the story and how you feel about, for example, in this case, this is a friend of mine. He and I have been friends for more than 20 years. And this is a person that, would draw his sword at the ready. This is a person you want if Armageddon hits. This is a person that just isn't easily rattled. And so when somebody like that tells you a story that makes them actually quake, it adds a little extra scare to it. And that's a classic element of most ghost stories. The reader finds credibility in the person telling the story, and it often starts out like this. Now, I don't ordinarily believe in these things.
That's the perfect line, right?
It's
That's
like,
the cliche right there.
this is like I don't now that's not exactly how this story started out, but that's an element that does exist throughout ghost stories is the credibility of the person telling you, and then they drop little hints about their own sanity. This is a very Lovecraftian thing to do. He'll start telling you a story and the person seems like an upstanding citizen, but then you find out that they may or may not have dabbled in the dark arts or spent some time in an institution. And even today, with like a lot of the modern, what do you want to call it? Like the sort of that modern crime suspense fiction that's happening with like things like Girl on a Train and some of these like more popular novels. The idea the whole time is that you are second guessing the person who's telling you the story, but only just a little bit. So every once in a while, you get a hint that they might be crazy or that they might, they might be on
Yeah.
something, that kind of
Gone Girl, right?
Gone
Everybody's the
Girl.
bad
Yeah.
guy.
Yes. Yes.
Everybody's doing something nefarious. Yeah, I got
Yes.
you.
And you never really, so it keeps you guessing. So those are, I guess, you can kind of cross like ghost stories and mystery over, and horror. Those all kind of, to me, that a lot of those genres just bleed together. Like you could call something a horror story, but it's also extremely suspenseful. If it weren't suspenseful,
Yeah.
you wouldn't keep turning the pages. Um, so anyway, the
Oh,
terrifying thing,
especially if you're guessing too, right? I mean, you want to know what's going to happen because
right?
you've got some
And
stake in it now.
yes, and even, someone like he's come up before when we've talked, like somebody like Stephen King. Now he's a master of horror and he writes, not just like your classic horror, but he's got a pretty wide range.
Hmm.
Some things are more science fictiony, some things are more fantasy. But he doesn't, you always like the character. You
Yeah,
always
absolutely.
like the main character and you feel that they have credibility. They're often just an average Joe or a professor or someone that you know wouldn't normally be wouldn't normally think these things were happening. But hey, I just walked through a portal in the basement of this diner and now I'm in 1962 or whatever. So the whole time you're kind of second guessing how this is plausible, and yet it's plausible. And those are all like the great elements. In this particular story, we call it I call it the thing that moans in the woods. My friend calls it the incident at Indian Springs. And in this story, um, just to give you the setting in which I was told the story, the story actually took place on a piece of rural property. And I was told this story on said property late at night around a
Huh,
fire.
perfect.
And what it yeah, right, so there you go. So what had happened is my friend, he grew up on this particular patch of mountain, and he was able to buy some land that was next to his grandparents' property, and he eventually was able then to acquire, like, the next 2 acres over, so he kinda had, like, a section, but this was, undeveloped woods that he spent his entire childhood in. He was raised by his grandparents, and he spent he knew every, nook and cranny of that holler, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So, nothing too unfamiliar with him. In addition, he's a scientist. He's a professional archaeologist. He's, gone to school for a number of years. He's got a very analytical mind. But of
So,
course,
so
he's
what you've done is you've set up credibility, right? He's grown
right.
up there his entire life. And not only that, he's grown up there his entire life, so he knows everything, but he's also a scientist and knows the hidden secrets of the world as well.
And not easily scared.
Hmm.
Strong man, not easily scared. Spent many, many a night in very rural or rough conditions, been out on like major excavations far from any kind of civilization, and spent the night in strange places and, had just but on the flip side of that, you also have a person who is an anthropologist, an archaeologist, who then therefore has a bit of an open mind about cultures and beliefs and things of that nature. But ultimately, his belief in ghosts or the supernatural comes directly from his own experiences as a child. So I wouldn't say he's a devout aficionado necessarily of the ghosty sort of genre, but at the same time, he had experiences as a young child that showed him that there was something there. So again, now you have a totally credible yet open-minded person, and about to tell you this story. So, and the story kind of starts out, and he says, "Okay, something really, really strange happened here a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not even sure if I want to tell you this." So immediately, right, what do? You're like, "Yes, I've got to
Yes, I
know this
want to know. I
story.
need
I've
to
got to
know.
know this story." And just keep in mind, this isn't a fictionalized, elaborated story. This is actually what happened. This is the sequence of but it still makes this terrifying ghost story. It had all of these elements that you would put into a ghost story if you were writing one.
Yeah.
So okay, so he has this piece of property. He's going to build a house on this property eventually. The only structure on the property is sort of a shed that's built around the wellhead. And he's put a bed in there, and what he does is he doesn't live there all the time, but he comes and he works on the land and he clears brush and starts to get it ready, to eventually have this house built there. And he and his then girlfriend would come out and they'd work, and then sometimes he would just stay the night there because it would get late and he wanted to get more work done. And again, he had sort of the type of job where he might be gone for 2 weeks and then he'd be around for a week because he might be sent out on like an excavation.
Where is this though? This is in
This is
California,
this is
or
in Northern California. Yeah,
okay?
in rural Northern California.
It's making it worse. I was picturing Minnesota.
Oh, I'm sure there are many. I mean, I'm sort of just now getting able to get to the point where people they will tell me stories, or they'll find me and tell me stories about Minnesota in particular. And just as a side note, it was really funny because I walked into a class this morning, a exercise class, and as I walked in, these two women were talking about a haunting and whether or not they believed in ghosts. And I didn't say anything.
What?
I
Why
just
not?
wanted because I wanted to hear what they were gonna say. They were kinda
Oh, I
in the
see.
other room, right? And I was, like, changing my socks or whatever. And I was just sort of listening, as they were talking about their real experiences and what they had. Like, the one instructor was actually saying as a child. So I was just sort of eavesdropping and kinda listening to this, just average people that you wouldn't weren't I it was just a funny timing that I walked in right at the moment that they were talking about ghost stories, and we had arranged to have this call this evening, so I thought, "Oh, it's serendipitous." So anyway, so here you are, so we're visiting, we're checking out the property, we're really excited about the property and that he's gonna be able to build this house, and, we're gonna stay in this little shed that he, mentioned, where he had been staying that the night that this happened. And he said, "So this really strange thing happened." So what happened was he was working on his property and he had been, it was starting to get dark, it was starting to get late. And it was a wellhead kind of shed, but he had like a really nice bed in there. It had electricity, he had a little TV and a little fridge, and it was more like a little guest cottage or something than just
Hmm.
like a shack. But it was still just a pretty basic structure. And so he had been working really hard. And instead of going back so he was also still renting a house, and his girlfriend was renting a house. And so they would kind of alternate between the three. But that particular night, he decided to just stay over. And it was he had really just acquired the property. So there was still a lot of brush around, and it was pretty early on in the process. So he spends his days clearing brush and, moving things around and trying to clean up the land because people had dumped like, old cars and stuff on it over the years. And it's about I guess, a 5-acre parcel. And it's kinda on the top of a hill, and there's some valleys that kind of roll down, and very lovely, lots of oak trees. So he settles in, he's very tired, he settles in, he's like, "Okay, it's getting dark." It's kind of that, like, twilight time, and he decides to just call it a night. So he gets himself ready, and he kinda just, like, decides to, fires up his computer or whatever and chill out in his little casa there. And he's just kinda just getting ready, it's getting dark, and he's just I think this was probably, like, late spring, early summer. So it wasn't really, really pitch dark, it wasn't like it was the dead of winter.
Mhm.
And he starts to hear this sound. I'm gonna pull the story up here too, just so I have the reference, because in the book, he wrote the story down, and then I published it pretty much as he told it, so it
Mhm.
wasn't just me retelling it. So he says, "I was just starting to kick back when I heard it, a loud, long, and low moan. My immediate thought that it was a sound traveling up from the valley below. There's a farm there that has miniature burrows, and they have been known to make strange noises, especially to the unaccustomed ear. Within seconds, however, it was clear this was no donkey. A low note began again, resonating in a way that it is almost indescribable. It was guttural, or the lowest of a baritone range, so low that the cabin and the ground, the items in the windowsill, all began to vibrate. There's a musical term, hemisync, when a sound is felt more than heard. I began to feel very isolated up on that mountaintop all alone. As I inched toward the door, the sound truncated. It was as if the sound were in a vacuum. There was no echo or lingering resonance, it just stopped. There was no further noise of crashing bushes, no rustling in the woods. I crept up to the door, and I, a grown man who's traveled the world, spelunking in underground caverns and sleeping overnight in legendary haunted boathouses, began to feel as frightened as a little child. All the while, my mind was racing. If it couldn't be the burritos, then maybe it was a kid making some kind of sounds on a synthesizer that somehow carried up the hill, a joke to scare the neighbors. I opened the door, sure I was about to come face to face with something horrific. I put one foot out the door and saw nothing. I began to ease outside, thinking surely I'd spot something unnamed or maybe some injured animal. Just as I started to get outside, it began again, only this time it was closer, much closer. Whereas before it was clearly down in the valley below and eerie enough from there, now it was nearer. It was at once organic and electric, like a heartbeat but bellowing. It had this bass tone that again started everything around me vibrating with a low hum. I quickly stepped back into the room and could hear that it was getting closer still. Now it seemed to be approaching fast, as if it were a supersonic sprint up the mountain. Again, it stopped. It completely died away. Only moments later, as I allowed a brief sense of ease, it started up again, this time probably not more than 100 feet away. I began to weigh my options. Should I stay where I was? Should I go out looking for it? Okay, here's another great story, right? When the thing, you are starting to encounter the thing, what's your move? And the reader's saying, no way, don't go outside. Or if you're watching a horror, do not open the door. There's always that, but then there's the logic, right, that comes in. So you're saying, actually, this doesn't make sense. This can't be real. I have to open the door. I'm just being, I'm overreacting. It seemed to be coming toward me. The bellowing sound and things in my cabin went from vibrating to rattling, as if a small earthquake were taking place or a tractor were raging past. The sound was growing stronger and stronger, now not more than 50 feet away, coming from the midst of a stand of black oaks just below the cabin. And then it stopped. There was no lingering echo, no rustling leaves, crunching twigs or branches breaking, nothing. The sound simply ended. So then he goes on to say that the next day he actually talked to a neighbor, and the neighbor heard a very similar sound that ended with the sound of a splash into his pond and stopped at that point.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so again, he tells me this. The firelight is flickering low. And now we've all got to sleep on this damn property. With this thing. And the thing is I actually had to draw this story out of him. He sort of started out saying, so this thing happened, and then he almost immediately retracted it because he realized that he didn't know if he even wanted to talk about it. Again, another great element of a ghost story. The teller, the narrator is hesitant to share the evil information because they don't want to burden anyone else with it.
But that's only part of it, though, isn't it? Because then you need to investigate what that thing is. This guy doesn't want to know what it is. He just told you the first part of the story. Now you have to find out what this noise was.
Right. And now, I mean, of course he's curious about it. And of course he, sort of half wonders if it'll ever come back again. He has not heard it since, but he had never heard anything like that. And of course, a lot of times people hear stories like this and they say, well, it was probably a wild cat or a bobcat or some kind of wild animal.
What
But
do you think it is?
he had grown up, his whole life in this
Hmm.
area and had never heard anything like it. So it was so completely foreign. Well, interestingly, I couldn't find a lot of information about this, but that area there is Mayadu territory. So that's
Maidu?
Mayadu. And those were the indigenous people who lived in that area. And even specifically, kind of right around there were Mayadu and I believe Nisinon were the names of the groups that lived in that area. And was not able to find too much backup for this. And I looked and I looked in tons of Maya, old Mayadu tales and stories, but I found one mention in Mayadu stories, Ko Hun Eji. I don't know exactly how to say that. It's Kohuneje, is a hairy, beastly monster, similar in description to Bigfoot and Dogman. It lives in woodland areas and forests and eats human children. Now, I think we've talked before about the idea too, where something like that eats human children out in the woods was a cautionary tale to keep people
Yeah.
close to the fire. So there's some element of that with any kind of sort of legend or creature. But my first inkling when he said that it was some kind of like Wendigo or some kind of strange supernatural creature, and he was not willing to rule that out. And he said as time goes by, it's not one of those things that he thinks about all the time, but they live on that property now. He and his then girlfriend, now wife, they built a house there. When we visit them, we stay in that little casa. So I don't know really what it was, but I completely believe him and believe that he was, terrified by this thing that just sort of came out. And I also wondered if it was like some kind of banshee or warning, something sort of whipping through the valley, wreaking havoc and then disappearing. The whole spelunking
Was there
down into the
damage? Was there
there
people
was no
dead?
damage. No,
No
he couldn't
damage.
find. But again, the property was pretty rough at that point. Like there was
Mhm.
a lot of brush. There's this kind of brush there called manzanita. It's really, really thick, and so even if something were crashing through it, it would not necessarily like trample it all down. And it was pretty, it was not all cleared out. But he didn't see. He inspected, of course, the next day in the light of day, and didn't see anything. But still to this day, he also told me a story when I first met him about this weird shadow person that used to follow him around when he was a little boy. And so I've always sort of, anytime somebody has told you something that scares you, and also you can see just there's that little bit of terror still left in them, but
Yeah.
hesitant to talk
Yeah.
about it, which is another great element of a ghost story. I really shouldn't even tell you this, or I really hesitate to tell you this
This makes me
because
feel crazy, and you're gonna think
yeah,
I'm
you're
crazy after
exactly
I'm
you're
done.
that's exact those exact lines, right? Now this is gonna sound crazy, or you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I
Look,
swear that this
I'm
is what
not crazy.
and you
You
see
know,
that again and again with like all the great old Irish folk tales start out like that too. It's like this is gonna sound insane, but I saw a mermaid down on the beach, things like that. So
mhm. The next phase of that story for me, this is a meteorite screaming in from outer space, hits the lake, right?
right,
And the next morning,
right.
aliens come out.
Oh, exactly. It's just like this setup for that hovering unknown at the end of the
There's
tale
something there,
just
and it's death, and it's gonna be
rolls.
pain, and you're gonna
It's
regret finding out what it is, right?
yes.
You're
keep
not gonna
poking
be the
around
you're
and
not gonna
you'll
kill
be
the Bigfoot.
sorry. Yeah.
You're not killing the Bigfoot. You're this is Lovecraftian all over the place, right? You're gonna
Mhm.
find out what it is, go crazy by what the definition of what that thing is, and then the end of the story happens.
Yeah, isn't it wonderful? So,
Don't investigate it.
these are
That's
the
the
kind of stories that so I have several like that basically, I have always been drawn to the paranormal, and so I have always asked people, or people have volunteered to me their stories of their encounters. And for whatever reason, it's obvious that I'm not going to judge them or think that they're crazy. And in spite of that, I put a number of experiences that I had had in this book, but I've never really had anything quite that, terrifying. I've had
you
a
don't
lot
like
of
to
real
share your personal stories, do you?
So this time in this book, I actually did share a lot of personal stories. And the funny thing was is that I kinda started out thinking like, I haven't really had that many experiences. And then when I started writing, I realized that I've actually probably had, a number, and possibly even more than, the average person. But and there's only been like one or two things that really scared me, and one thing that started happening had my son. Um,
Oh,
I had a lot of uh, strange noises and just other things kind of happening in the apartment, toys going off in the other room. Now, every parent has heard that, like, terrifying electronic toy go off in the other room
yeah.
in the night, and it can be a battery or you threw everything into a box and it shifts. So there's a lot
Mhm.
of reasons. I remember one time, though, was quite
I mean,
quite
that's really what we are talking about with ghost stories, isn't it? It's doubt. You just
doubt.
don't know.
Yes.
Because I mean, that's what I mean.
Yes.
We open up death fantasies with ghost stories too. What
Yes,
happens after you die?
absolutely.
The life after
What
death
happens after
thing.
you die? Yeah, and
But
that's
you never, right, look a ghost in the eye, shake its hand, and say, "Hello, I am me, and you're a ghost." Right? I mean, that doesn't happen in any of these stories. It's always
typically
just,
not. There is always the element of doubt, although actually see or have conversations, know at the time that. So here's the thing that's really about supernatural experiences and ghosts. It's scarier to imagining what it would be like than it is when you actually have that experience, because
but
in
what's
that
the
moment when you're
experience
having
though?
that experience in that moment when you're having that experience, it's very matter of fact, and the doubt is, your logic kicks in. So for example, one time I was sleeping and I woke up because I felt something kind of, pressing down on the covers at my feet.
Yeah.
And my thought as I'm waking up was like, like the way how it feels when a cat curls up. And I'm waking up and I was like, oh, it's just like, it's such a comforting feeling. And then I remembered
Oh,
I
don't
do
talk about
not have a
cats.
cat. So I sit up and I'm like, okay, I don't see the depression or anything like that in the covers, but I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay, that definitely happened, but maybe I just was like dreaming. So start to go back to sleep. It happened again. It actually happened 3 times. And the third time I just got up and put the light on and I said, look, I don't want to do this. I just said that out loud. I was just like, I can't handle this. I
But
can't.
shouldn't it be? I mean, I think we talked about this last time we talked, right? I mean, shouldn't it be kind of a joyous moment? Kind of the realization that when you die, there's something, right?
So here's the thing, and this is yes, yes and no, but
But
also
we're terrified of it
in
at the
the
same time.
moment,
When you tell a ghost story, you're not trying to like enlighten somebody to feel good about the fact that inevitably they're going to die. What you're doing is trying to freak them out about being alive and interacting with what they'll eventually be. Oh my God, have you ever been to Rome?
I've never been to Rome, but I have been to Venice and done. I have a book of Venetian ghost stories, and I did a midnight
Maybe
walk
you're.
alone,
What about the
wandering
monks?
around, trying to find the ghosts.
Well, specifically the monks who have they decorate with their bones, the bones of the dead or whatever. Do you know what I'm
Oh
talking about?
yeah, those. Yeah, I've been in a few of those ossuaries, and in
Ossuaries.
Paris there are catacombs have a story about the Parisian catacombs in my book. Now, I had been there, I encountered there, but a very well-known author and host of a number of haunted shows, and he's on television and does a podcast and has written dozens of books, shared his ghost story with me, and it was actually his first encounter, and it took place in the catacombs under Paris,
It's
which are
crazy.
lined with bones.
Yeah, I've seen pictures.
Yeah, yeah.
I've only been to this one church in Rome and seen the monks that have basic. It's so crazy, but basically what they're saying is, what you are, we were, and what we are, you will become, and that's
But
what
and
we.
some people feel that if you have bones around, it's, there's like energy to it. Just like someone might keep a little bit of your ashes in an urn because they
Yeah,
feel that it's part of you. And then other people will look at that and basically just be ashes to ashes, dust to
it's
dust.
very
You're
interesting.
done.
So,
But
I mean,
just
are we
going back
talking
to
about
that,
that?
like,
We're talking about the
people
remnants of life, right?
moment though.
We're not talking about we're talking about remnants of life, basically. We're talking about bones, we're talking about ashes, and we're talking about a ghost. It's not the spirit. It's not. This is all very religious, right? I mean, we're talking about kind of Christianity, ghosts going to heaven, and this is not the part that goes to heaven. This is
Well,
like
there's also
access.
there are a ton of haunted objects, and that's a whole other kind of
So crazy, isn't
interesting
it?
way of looking at ghost stories, because that is saying that a person's spirit has somehow imparted in an inanimate object. And I mean, the whole paranormal parlor, the whole idea behind
Yeah,
that
it's
is,
so cool.
these seances, this way of trying to make contact and prove that there's evidence of life after death. Now, many of the people who were part of this spiritualist movement, who believed in life after death and the ability to, not just life after death as in like whether you go to heaven or hell or whatever, but life after death as in, ghosts are among us and can communicate with us. That was the spiritualist movement, and that was really on the rise in sort of late Victorian, through like the 1920s or 30s in the United States and England. And that is when that was a turning point. It was a turning point for ghosts in literature. It was a turning point for ghosts in plays. Of course, there wasn't television then. Turning point for ghosts in popular culture. It really, really gave rise to that. And, it was, seances in the White House kind of thing.
Well, you can go back to Shakespeare for ghosts, right? I mean,
Sure, sure. You can go back, and you can go back to like, the Greeks and the Romans for life after death and communicating with the beyond or with the supernatural.
well, that's
This was
interesting.
a specific, like, you can use any average person can use these tools, and a ghost will talk. And there was a lot of charlatanism, of course, that rose out of this. And that gave way to, people making fun of it,
Yeah.
people doing parodies.
Well,
The
in Greece, what you could actually bribe your way into the underworld, the Hades or whatnot, and grab whoever you want and remove them if you had the money and the resources and the time or
like,
whatever,
so awesome.
right? I mean,
Like, I'll
is
take
that what you're
you
talking?
and you and
Yeah.
you. Well,
I
and
mean,
also,
Hercules broke in and Odysseus broke in. I was like, everybody's breaking into hell or the afterlife and stealing people. But
right,
they
and
have
also
actual,
the idea that, people, not just gods or goddesses, but that people had a way to use an oracle or another kind of divination to communicate with non-physical entity. So that is the underlying score to what this spiritualist movement, was at the turn of the, that it was had its backbone in, of course, hundreds of years of people believing all kinds of. These were very stalwart, upstanding members of society, including the first lady, who began to accept that you could communicate with a ghost if you just had the right tools and the right person in the room. So,
why does it matter so much though, right? I mean, in terms of humanity, in terms of what we are as a species, I was just wondering, the cave paintings in France and Spain and whatnot, they don't really express anything afterlife, do they? They just express hunting and the gathering of humans together more than anything else. So I guess they weren't really thinking about life after death at that point in our development.
Well,
They
that's
weren't telling ghost
interesting.
stories around the campfire in
Well, they
nighttime.
might have been as a survival tactic, I think there's a lot of speculation about the awakening of mankind in terms of
It's a very
when
interesting
we
discussion,
began to
right?
realize that we were going to die.
But we were
And
dying
once
then.
Right, and once we realized there would be there was an awakening moment that coincided with death
Because they were not
that
they were not telling. I don't. Maybe they were. I mean, we don't know. But it wasn't important enough for them to depict it on their cave paintings. That one shaman who, I don't know. Maybe there was an interpretation there that we're just not getting.
Well,
Um,
actually, it's funny that you even mentioned that because I had I wouldn't say an argument, but a pretty heated discussion with a professor of anthropology one time.
mhm.
And he was giving sort of that, and also the example of, I think, Spartans. He was giving the example of Spartans, and that Spartans didn't have like art or kind of culture that showed that they were fighting to be immortal. And I beg, I said I beg to differ. I think that their very nature of trying to be the best warrior, the best, at what they could be, was in itself
Well, weren't they? They are
a
appearing to
toe
a
to toe with death.
yeah.
Like,
Weren't they?
you will remember me after I die. And so art is also an example of that.
But
Art
they
is
were. They
life
had a
after
code.
death.
Spartans, I think they had a code that they had to follow to the letter. They're a very rule-based society, I think. They
But
weren't
yet
trying
there
to.
was a level of immortality to it
It's the
because
code,
you would
maybe.
be
Yeah.
remembered after the fact. And that need to be remembered after the fact, to make your mark, whether you're carving your initials in a picnic bench or you're painting on a cave, you are acknowledging that, you want to have left a mark. And I think that that is the turning point for understanding the fear of death, the understanding that we would die, and kind of so the only way to fight death is to live forever. The only way to live forever is to be remembered forever for something.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's really true. Because I mean,
And
people
that's why
do.
we're fascinated with vampires too, right? Same thing.
They
We've
live
talked
forever.
about vampires. Yeah, same as that lust for immortality. In a literary sense, it's just like, okay, we're gonna get this bite, and then we're gonna live forever, and we're gonna be sort of like haunted by that. But in
So in the
reality,
sense of
go ahead.
like a ghost story, though, we are talking about Christianity, because the hell of being a ghost is that you don't get to go to heaven.
Well, in Western ghost stories, yes, but
Yeah.
there are ghost stories
Well,
throughout the
that's a very good
world.
point. Yeah, I guess that is
Yeah,
true. What
there are
are
ghost stories throughout the world. In fact, I have a ghost story.
well, there are afterlives all over the world too. And if
Yeah,
you are a
of
ghost, you're being
course.
kept away from that afterlife, or whatever it is, being reincarnated to the Buddhist or going to
Right.
wherever, blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. But if you're a ghost, you're not doing that. And it's kind of oh, well, why am I on Earth if I don't get to do the big paradise thing at the end of the day?
Now,
Potentially, I'm not
some
saying I
ghosts,
know, I'm just
right, but
spitballing.
some ghosts, especially in like literature, and you see this all the time in Shakespeare, right? Those are vengeance ghosts. Those are ghosts who are back here to teach us a lesson. And you
Hmm.
even have that in A Christmas Carol, right? You've
Yeah.
got that ghost has returned to teach us a lesson. So that's one kind of ghost story where the ghost returns to seek revenge and teach the mortal people a lesson.
Mhm.
I mean, they probably all have elements to that. There's the sort of romantic ghost story, which often involves a lost love, but it's not necessarily your lost love, but you're missing something in your life and you let this house or something. And then there's this ghost of this woman that wanders the halls. And for whatever reason, it presents itself only to you.
So we talked about the beginning of a ghost story. That setup, classic setup, right? Was it James Joyce? Who the hell was the guy? He framed it like 4 or 5 times before he actually got into his dumb ghost story. I was so unbelievably bored before the first frame. I couldn't even get any farther than that. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's classic. It's like one of the first ghost stories, but it's framed like they're talking about the a letter they read, and then
Uh,
they read the letter, and
Not
the
the
letter is
Canterbury Tales, you're not
that's what
talking
it
about
is.
that. Is it? I know, the
Yeah,
Canterbury Tales is a rough one.
it's
It's
horrible.
it's long and it's
I mean,
long.
people talk about going back in time and murdering Hitler in his crib. Let's just go back in time.
Just
No, I'm joking.
make him read the Canterbury
All
Tales.
those
Make him read
all those
Chaucer for, like, all infinity until he gets it.
make Brit
Um,
Lit just about Shakespeare. That'll be fine.
yeah, so what happens, right? So then you have the setup, then you have the encounter or the encounters, there's usually more than one. Often at that point, after the second or third encounter, an outside party is brought in. It could be an actual investigator, it could be your significant other, your brother, somebody is brought in to bring reason to this situation. That's another classic element. Not
The
all ghost stories
non-believer.
follow that, but you've got a
Yeah, the
rational, somebody
non-believer.
rational comes in and tries to restore order. And then that's when it really turns because now you've in theory done everything you can, right? You've already done everything you can to show that there's no way that this could be just made up, and then the encounter escalates somehow. In Lovecraft, you usually have some kind of insane escalation where you open a closet door and you actually end up on, like, basically another planet or, in the belly of the earth. In, some of the more mild ghost stories, you're gonna have a sort of an encounter where you actually do see it in some of the more romantic ones, especially like Montague Road James and sort of that era. He was known mostly for being a bit of a romance writer, but he had a lot of romantic ghost stories. And in this one, he talks. It's called like the Orchard or the Orchard Bride. He finally actually talks to her, and the ghost tells their story. So you have the escalation of the encounter, and then you have the ghost telling the story.
Yeah.
I was killed by the well. My father, hung my love. I mean, whatever the story is for why the ghost is there. And then sometimes you just have like complete descent into madness, or you have something wonderful like the yellow wallpaper. Are you familiar with that story? That's the probably one of my favorite ghost stories of all time,
The
because it's
yellow
the yellow
wallpaper?
wallpaper. And you probably read it at some point.
Well, hold on, I'm
Um,
trying to Google it so I can tell you I'm
it's
familiar
it's
with it. Now
Charlotte
I'm familiar with it.
it's Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and I think that's her name. And
Yes.
what it is this is real common, and it's the wife who's gone a little off, and so
Oh,
she's
yeah.
sent to the countryside so that she can take some air. Maybe she's having postpartum
1892.
or something
That's
like that.
perfect for that type of story, right?
Right, exactly, the peak, and she is locked away
Of
because this
course.
is what happened to Victorian women. They were locked away, and this is also
Dangerous in
why so
themselves.
many Victorian women were so interested in becoming a medium, or you could gain fame and notoriety and get out of your house without having to be a prostitute or without having to, do what your husband wants you to do. You could
Without having
actually,
to be masturbated by a doctor.
yeah, you could break free, right? Right. So then you have, okay, so she's locked away in this room, and I think she has postpartum. I don't know if that's actually the case, but I remember thinking that when I read it. It sounded um like she had this kind of break. Maybe it just reminded me of like the way you would feel after you've lost a child or something. Anyway, she starts seeing patterns in the wallpaper
Mm.
in this room. And eventually she strips the wallpaper and everybody's telling her there's nothing wrong. And in the end, she becomes the wallpaper and she's the woman who's trapped in the room. So you either have resolution like, oh, it's all jolly good, you've learned your
Yeah.
lesson, and now the ghost is now free. Or you have the person who kind of just descends into madness and becomes the ghost themselves.
What is it? Shutter Island, right? That Leonardo DiCaprio movie, if
Oh
you're familiar
yeah,
with it.
that's a good
At the
movie.
end, you're like, "Whoa."
I haven't seen that in years. Hey, that's a good rewatch.
Right?
I haven't
Martin
seen that in
Scorsese. I've
years.
only seen it one time, but it was a shocker, right? You thought it was going in a totally different way.
Yeah.
It turns out he's a lunatic or something along
And
those
what's
lines. I
the
mean, it
other
makes
one?
no sense. You watch it one time and it's like a brilliant movie, and then you dissect it later on at home. It's like, oh,
Oh,
that,
now you get it. Yeah.
yeah,
Or The Others. Do you remember that movie with Nicole
yeah.
Kidman? And it turns
Natalie,
out
Nicole Kidman.
she's so, and it just seems like this very dark, depressing house, and it turns out, sorry, spoiler alert, mute your whatever if you haven't seen this movie, but she's actually the ghost.
Yeah, it's really
So
good.
yeah, so it's so there's always there's that turn. So either you become the ghost, you are the ghost, or there's resolution. Like I said, you learned your lesson. Everybody agrees to go their separate ways, or the next victim comes along, and that seems to be you can look at a number of ghost stories, modern, old, something someone's told you, and what makes it great are I think some of those elements because it has to give you just enough doubt and just enough curiosity to keep going.
God, man, but you know what's so funny? I don't know. Maybe this is a modern thing in terms of ghost stories, but you're looking at answers, right? You're looking at there's rules, there's science, there's physics, there's chemistry, there's the human body,
Yeah.
there's the way things work, and then there's what the fuck is that? It shouldn't be happening. You know what I mean? You have
Which is
answers. There's
why
something
the
more than reality out there.
which is why you have to have your main character has to be someone of credibility, right? They have to have a background in science because
Yeah,
they're applying that makes it more plausible to the reader. So that even though you might not relate to this situation at all, if it's a good ghost story, 1892 Orchard or whatever,
yeah,
if it contains those elements, you'll continue going. Or, of course, how could we not talk about Edgar Allan Poe if we're going to talk
right.
about the great ghost story? There's always an element of impending madness in
Well,
those
and in terms of
characters.
Edgar Allan Poe, what do you have? The Telltale Heart, which he's kind of
Mhm.
haunted by the murder that he covered up, or the
Yes.
murder he did.
Yeah, so those aren't necessarily ghost stories, right, in the same way, but you have a lot of those same elements, or The Mask of the Red Death. You have these situations where, somebody has gone there's a lunatic element, and that's being, taken out on either the protagonist or there's another person that they're like what's the cask of Amonti what is it, the cask of Amontillado, where he walls his friend up and
Yeah.
leaves him to die in the wall. I mean, it's just so brutal and so dark, and just this incredibly so I think that kind of thing, that's the burial, that's the fear of being buried alive, and that's a huge element in a lot, especially during I'd say, like, probably the Victorian or early 1800s through the maybe teens, 19 teens. The fear of being buried alive, was just tremendous, and that was a huge, theme that repeated in, pulp fiction and horror stories, the idea
Yeah.
that, you actually weren't dead, and these were actually medical cases, but now in the Victorian era, we have a little more knowledge, right? So we're not back in medieval times when this happened all the time, and then we called it a werewolf or a vampire. Now we're in, like, relative modern times where we have a pretty good understanding of the human body and some of the systems, and still there's that fear that you could be buried alive, that you would be awake and completely conscious for your slow and unavoidable death. That's the
Nowadays,
greatest
I mean,
fear.
what do you think? Because that was back in the day. What medically you would be worried about going into surgery and not waking up, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
I don't know. You're
absolutely.
inevitable. You're gonna die. That's the bad part about medical science now. Not that they're gonna think you're dead and bury you alive. That's probably not gonna happen, but they're probably gonna kill you.
Well, there is a little coma fear, though. We do have coma fear, and we have comas appearing as a device in literature, as a way of explaining gaps of time, or The idea, what a terrifying idea that you're actually completely conscious and you can hear and see everything in the room, but they don't
Yeah.
know
Oh
that
my
you
God.
can't communicate,
There's been
right?
Twilight Zone episodes and
Yeah,
Show
exactly,
episodes on that exact
exactly.
subject. They're freaky. Like
Yeah,
they can feel what's happening to them too. I mean, yeah, it's a total trope of that whole genre. They can
and
feel what's happening, or they don't feel it, and they're still alive, and they can't release. I mean,
you're
the
like
whole.
you're screaming, right? You're screaming inside, but nobody can hear you. That's the coffin. Your coffin is a hospital bed.
I mean, honestly, isn't that what we're doing more than anything else? Is we're pulling the fabric back on death and saying "boo."
Well, yeah, I mean, for the ghost story, and then in like modern ways, since we, poo-poo a lot of the ideas about ghosts and death from the early part of the century. Now, what are the things that we're afraid of? We're afraid that we're being spied on all the time. We're afraid of the man. We're afraid that somebody is going to break into our home or do something to our children.
Yeah,
We're afraid to stop looking at Facebook, but we're afraid to look at Facebook. I mean, we have all these kinds of sort of modern elements. Those are more elements of horror than they would be the ghost story. But the modern ghost is maybe a little bit more a semblance of who you were meant to be or who you were supposed to be, a missed opportunity, right? Ghosts are totally missed opportunities, a
yeah, and
turning point.
the thing about our world, our modern world, is we don't have to be afraid of ghosts anymore because we have worse things to be afraid of. Like you said, the
Right.
boogeyman is the dude at the grocery store that follows you home. You know what I mean?
Right.
That you don't know who's stuck into
The
your
living
house.
yeah, the living and people always
Yeah.
say to me, "I it's so morbid to spend so much time in cemeteries." It's like, this is the safest place to be, right? Like, this cemetery, I can see who's coming. I can,
Nobody's
like,
gonna touch them here.
I
Everybody's already done their thing.
and no
You know,
one's
it's
gonna
really
question you if you're crying or upset because you're in a cemetery, so it's really a safe place to be. It's the people that, are, like you said, waiting in the parking lot. Those are the people those are the
worse. I mean, I went to the
worst.
dentist. My dentist is on 45th Street.
Oh, that dental,
Well, no, no, not I. My dentist is on 45th Street, and walking towards Times Square is the exact route that dude last summer took running over people in New York City,
oh, right, so there's
right?
the
But
modern okay,
right, and then
yes.
even additionally to that, that Halloween, me and my wife were driving our twins to Ditmas Park to do their Halloween parade, and we had to go through downtown Manhattan. And right when we were hitting the West Side Highway, that other dude was running people over on the freaking bike path there. I missed that dentist thing by a day, and we were almost involved in that whole horrible situation by like 4 or 5 blocks. So I mean,
Yeah,
the nightmare is like around us
right.
every single
Going
day.
to a concert and being gunned down, sending our children to school.
It's interesting that my idea of death or these ghost stories is kind of like, okay, there is something else instead of, oh, I'm so scared of you as a ghost, because no, it's like a definition.
That's interesting too because, it's almost like because of ghost stories, there's a certain level of comfort there. There is a certain level of like, okay, actually, you could come back and totally, you've seen that meme, like when I die, I promise I'll come back and totally haunt
Right.
you.
I mean, you're gonna be able to relay that final message.
And the belief in that, or even if it's just the temporary suspension of the world around you and you're lost in the ghost story and believing that this could all be happening, that this is all plausible, in itself, that's a comfort
Yeah.
because there's some kind of resolution. I mean, stories don't just some stories just end. They don't have the resolution. We don't know what happened. But those are more of the stories that people tell you firsthand
Well, that's what
in
these
in
are,
a
aren't they?
literary way, in literature, there's a
Yeah. These are the resolutions to somebody's story,
yeah.
right? I mean, they're the ghost is the final chapter on that person's life or whatever it is. But when we're not really
And
talking,
aren't we haunted by them forever? We're haunted by the memory, we're haunted by the pictures, we're haunted by
right?
the idea and the fear that it could happen
Well, not the
Not to
fear, the
us. We're not so
knowledge,
worried it's gonna happen to us, we're worried it's gonna happen to somebody that we love. What's
and
we
have to
worried it's
go through that, right? And have to
yeah,
go the haunting of not having them with us.
and
What a
being
fascinating
the
idea, because
right?
when you
Being the
lose somebody,
survivor
that's
is
like
more
it haunts
terrifying.
you. It haunts
Yes,
you. It really it
absolutely.
hurts and it's painful, and that's what's scary, and you don't wanna go through it because it's the worst thing ever.
It is, and you
It's
also
like
have
breaking up with somebody that you love is kind of the same thing too. It's really painful, and you don't wanna deal with it.
no.
Yeah.
No, you don't wanna deal with it, and you don't want to have to, like, look it in the eye or look at it or look at what your part in it is.
Yeah, and that's what ghosts are too, in a way too, because they are the physical embodiment of death, and you have to look at them. You have to be confronted with what's gonna happen to you.
Right,
That's pretty cool.
right, and yet you get an answer, which we never really will. No matter how much we read or how much we believe, we can subscribe to one belief or another, but there's lots of people who say they have evidence, but that evidence is subjective.
Exactly. And your friend with his story, I mean, how amazing is that? He heard something and he identifies that as something spooky. And in actuality, maybe it was a meteorite whistling through the atmosphere, melted in a certain way that's what the sound it was creating.
Or some kind of military drone. I mean, we did talk
Yes.
about that. I was like, could it have been some sort of
Could it have
strange
been, right? You don't know
drone?
100%,
Why did
but
it make that noise? Why did it sound
chances
like a
are,
wounded
though,
animal?
like 100%, it's going to have a rational reasoning behind it. Everything does, right?
Well, possibly. I mean, some things, the rational reasoning is that it was Bigfoot.
But
I mean, sometimes that's all you got. It was like,
in
that was
in the
Bigfoot.
in the what do they call it? In the face of possibility, everybody's a skeptic or can be or something like I don't know, I just made that
Yeah.
up.
Well, no, that's great, and that actually ties in with something that you said at the very beginning about the doubt and that, would that encounter have a joyous moment? And what I was kinda getting at is that when you are having, at least for me, the idea of having a ghostly encounter is a lot scarier than the actual event, because in my life, in the times that I have had a paranormal encounter, you're just, it's not the time slows, but you are not accepting what's happening in that moment as a ghostly experience. You are accepting it as an experience.
That's very true. That's so
And then
interesting.
later you look at it and you go, "Wait, that doesn't make any sense." So I get this tap on my forehead one night at about 3 in the morning. Tapped real hard on my forehead, and I thought something dripped from my ceiling. And I, in fact, looked up and thought, "Is my ceiling, something leaking?" And I'm looking around, did I have some sort of fluid near me? Those are, but it's burning. It's this, I can feel it. It's like somebody put peppermint oil on my forehead. And I'm
Interesting.
thinking, what the heck? Okay, so this was, but I'm not scared. I'm just like, this is really, I'm looking for all the rational reasons. And then as I start to just, like, dismiss all of those and let those go, and the feeling starts to fade and I fall back asleep, and the next day I'm just like, "Wait, that doesn't make any sense.
Well,
That
the
doesn't
thing
make any
is,
sense.
it's
What
like
was that?"
you can't remember the way things feel, I don't think.
I
Have
can
you ever
actually. Yeah,
can
yeah,
you?
I do. Yes, I remember the way things feel, and in fact, when I dream smells and feelings, and I have very textural dreams. So, I have, a
Yeah,
pretty
it's
good
called something, isn't it? Oh,
Mm,
well, you're
it's
about to tell me
lucid
what it was?
dreaming? Lucid
No,
dreaming,
the thing
yeah.
where you can, what is it called? You remember the way things feel, because you're normally not supposed to be able to remember the way things feel, or pain anyway, and I'm not sure if that correlates to just
Mm,
normal things. Like, if I go upstairs, I mean, as a writer, obviously, you can sit down in front of the computer and describe how something may feel, but the actual physical sensation of the carpet or whatever, that doesn't really exist in your mind. So what you felt in your forehead, if you put peppermint oil on your forehead, that sensation would have occurred. But because you didn't have peppermint oil, you might imagine what peppermint oil would feel like, but you wouldn't actually feel peppermint oil. You know what I mean? Does that make
um,
sense? Or did
I
that make
guess, yeah, I guess, but what I'm saying is that I had this thing happen that didn't make any sense. It woke me up. It was
exactly?
as if somebody thunked me on the forehead. It
Yeah.
remained cold, not for an extended period of time, but it remained cold for probably about 4 or 5 minutes, so that I didn't by the time I was fully awake and putting the light on and checking the ceiling, I could still feel it lingering on my forehead.
Does it
And
correlate to anything else though that you've ever heard? Did anybody else describe that type of
I had never
experience in a
heard a
haunting?
description of that, but when I told my mom about it, she thought that she had been telling me before that there was a particular I was pretty confident there was some kind of, ghost rattling around. It was the attic of an old Victorian.
Yeah.
She told me that there was a specific ghost in that she thought, well, this is my mom, she thought that the reason that the activity increased during when after we brought our baby home was because the ghost it was the top floor, and she thought that it was probably like a nanny or a servant's quarters, and that person resonated with the child, like that, whatever this person's imprint or ghost or whatever. So she said it sounded like an awakening. It was like somebody thunked you on the forehead to wake you up, like you needed to pay attention to something. And
Uh-huh.
that didn't really, but I guess my point is, it's not whether or not it happened or why, but what my point is that in that moment, I'm looking for all the rational explanations. And it really isn't until after the fact, when you consider that you tried all those rational explanations and there isn't one, that's when you start kind of having that,
Exactly.
like, oh my God, what was it? Because
Exactly.
in
That's
that
when
moment,
you
you're
start
dealing
making
with it, right? You're
connections
just
or
dealing with it. You're like,
you're
no,
looking
this
for
could.
something other than reality.
Yeah, but when it happens, you're looking for the most rational explanation. You're immediately looking like, okay, that had to just drip from the ceiling. There's no doesn't make sense. So you're trying to make sense of it. And
Yeah.
then later you consider it and analyze it and realize that um there is no explanation for it.
I mean, honestly, this is such a fantastic, a fascinating subject. I mean, we've been telling ghost stories for a long time, centuries at least. I mean, if you count Hamlet, Shakespeare, before that, it's just a really fascinating subject. I mean, it broaches life after death, right? And that's just a really fascinating way to spend an hour of time.
Absolutely. Okay. Okay. I was thinking of June 1st because I actually am on Coast to Coast that night.
Good for you.
Yeah, and the reason I was thinking of it is because I
I
have
wish
to.
there was a way to listen to Coast to Coast that wasn't like
You can. No, you
into the.
can. You just have to get on, you have to listen to it when it's happening, and that's,
Yeah,
and it has to be it's just on, like, your local AM station,
I
and
want a podcast.
yeah, to get the podcast. Well, my mom, like, had figured out a way to she just popped a tape in
Oh,
and
did you?
recorded it, 'cause they will not give you anything. Like, a lot of times when you do a radio interview, they'll send you a disc if you ask, of a recording of your interview. And I did that a lot in the beginning. Now I've had so many interviews, it's just like I can't stand the sound of my own voice. But with Coast to Coast, my mom just recorded it, like, she totally pirated it. I was so proud of her. Okay, thanks, Bryan.
I will talk to you
Have a
soon.
lovely evening. Okay, take care.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.